Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking to yourself, why the hell is he wearing a suit jacket? Well, my answer to that would be, why not? No, truthfully, I have to go to a wedding this weekend, and this was just hanging in the closet. Anyway, we're not here to talk about suit jackets, we're here to talk about Castlevania. Oh yeah, Castlevania. Castlevania is one of my favorite NES games to play, and it shows its age, but I still really enjoy going back and playing it. The controversial sequel, Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, really I haven't played enough of to comment on. Castlevania 3, however, excellent game, one of my favorites on the NES, period. But while the NES was getting all these great Castlevania games, the Sega Master System was sort of left in the dark, and that's probably the biggest problem with the Sega Master System. It just didn't have third-party support. You can probably blame Nintendo for that, as they pretty much held a stranglehold on developers that developed games for the NES. So the likelihood of a Castlevania game coming out on a Sega console were pretty slim. It is worth mentioning, though, that the original, was ported to a couple of home computers like the Commodore 64, the Commodore Amiga, and the IBM home computer. So while people differ in opinions on Castlevania 2, it's still considered to be a classic trilogy on the NES. But with the 16-bit era beginning and the 8-bit era coming to an end, the expectations for a Castlevania sequel would be through the roof.
In December of 1991, all speculation was put to rest because the release of Super Castlevania 4 had arrived. Though basically a remake of the original Castlevania, it beats the NES games in nearly every aspect. Starting with the graphics, which are an obvious improvement over the NES games, the amount of detail is very impressive in both the background, the foreground, the level design, and the character sprites. Simon Belmont has received a complete makeover and looks more like the vampire hunter he's supposed to be. The enemies also look very nice. With each stage you complete, you'll be introduced to new enemies as well as some familiar ones. In fact, one of the coolest aspects of the game is completing a level and moving on to a completely new area with new enemies. All 11 stages look very different from one another. One stage will have you in a swamp, then next in a cave, then a library, and so on. Waiting at the end of each stage is a boss. Going along with the precedent set before it, the bosses are all very different looking, and the stages you fight them in are different as well. However, one thing I noticed is that the bosses tend to play in a very similar fashion. You just need to detect the pattern and attack as many times as possible. Very few bosses actually gave me much trouble. They're somewhat of a challenge, but not quite as much as in the original Castlevania games, in my experience anyway. One thing that does make things easier is your arsenal of weaponry. You have your standard whip, which is upgradable 2 times. Then you have a secondary weapon, which could include holy water, an axe, a dagger, a cross boomerang, and a stopwatch. The weapons really come in handy, especially during the boss battles. And my preferred weapon of choice is definitely the cross boomerang. Complementing the graphics is some great music. At times it's fast-paced and frantic, but most of the time it's slow and haunting. Personally, I find the fast-paced music to be more memorable, but the slow tunes do fit the atmosphere. A nice touch is the remastered version of classic Castlevania songs that play during the last level before Dracula. So the graphics are good, and the music follows suit, but what about the most important thing? Gameplay. Well, it's vastly improved. Most notably, you now have the ability to whip in 8 directions, which is tremendously helpful. You can also hold the attack button and move the D-pad to jiggle the whip, helping in killing enemies like bats and Medusa heads that have those tricky patterns. Also, a new feature is having a dedicated button to use your secondary weapon. In this case, it's the R button. Perhaps one of the nicest things about the new control scheme is how Simon jumps. You can now control him in midair to help making jumping more precise, which is a welcome improvement. Unfortunately, though, it's not all good news. While jumping is improved, it still feels stiff and unnatural. The game suffers the most when it relies heavily on precise jumping and maneuvering, which is extremely apparent on the last couple levels. Another problem is that you're still knocked backwards when you're hit, a flaw among the entire series that feels more like an unfair addition than anything else. Overall, the game controls better, but it still suffers in the platforming department. Another bummer is the censorship that the North American version has. The blood is basically non-existent, unlike the PAL version of the game. There's one level in particular that has green slime flowing through the level. It looks alright, but in the PAL version, the slime is blood. It doesn't affect the game, but come on, blood is better than slime any day. The end of the game has you fighting the Prince of Darkness himself, after defeating some minor bosses first. In a real show of mercy, the game puts a checkpoint right before Dracula's battle, so if you die, you start over right there. And even if you get a game over, you still get to start there. There's also a little secret that allows you to fill up on hearts, upgrade your whip, and receive the boomerang weapon right before the battle. Still though, with all that the game gives you, Dracula is still a challenging boss. It's odd though. He doesn't sporadically jump around and attack you constantly like I would have thought. Perhaps more true to his character, he transports himself around the stage and fires projectiles in a rather slow fashion. It sounds easier than it is because all of his hits take away several health points. However, after some practice and patience, you'll finally beat him. It's somewhat disappointing actually, but the rest of the game more than makes up for it. Afterwards, you can play through the game again, but this time it's on a much more higher difficulty setting. Overall, Castlevania 4 is great. It's frustrating and unfair at times, but the amount of fun you'll have while playing it will make it well worth the frustration. This is one of the games that I will always come back to, and I consider it one of my favorite Super Nintendo games.
By the time the Super Nintendo rolled around, Nintendo's stranglehold on its developers was pretty much over. This proved to be a great asset to Sega, actually, because now it allowed for a lot more third-party support on the Genesis, way more than the Sega Master System ever saw. So now, a Castlevania game on the Sega Genesis seemed like a real possibility. And they were treated to that game in 1994 with Castlevania Bloodlines, released 5 years after the Genesis and 3 years after Super Castlevania 4. The question really is, was Castlevania Bloodlines worth the wait? Well, the answer is, yep.
Bloodlines is a great example of a game that does a lot of things right, but also does a few things wrong. The only question you have to ask yourself is, do the pros outweigh the cons? Let's start with things the game does right. Bloodlines seems to be more plot-focused than previous games, as it tries to tie in the Bram Stoker novel with Castlevania lore. The story goes, after Quincy Morris defeated Dracula in the novel, Europe was at peace. The Crown Prince of Austria is killed by Elizabeth Bartley in her quest to revive her uncle, Count Dracula, which results in dark days for Europe and eventually World War I. Now, the characters John Morris, a descendant of the Belmont and Morris family, and Eric Lacarde, a Spaniard on a vengeance mission after his love was turned into a vampire by Dracula, are both playable and both add different elements to the game. John wields the classic whip while Eric has the spear. I prefer to play as John, as he plays more like the classic Castlevania character, but Eric is a cool character to play as. John has the ability to use his whip and grab a hold of above platforms and swing to new areas. You could do the same thing in Castlevania 4, but you can only grab hooks placed in the levels. Here you can grab nearly any surface above you, and it's a lot of fun once you get used to it. Eric has the ability to perform a super jump to get to new areas also. So the story and characters are good, but what else? Well, notably, the music, graphics, and above all, the setting. The music is extremely good, and it's definitely on par with Castlevania 4's music. Some classic tracks make an appearance, but it's the original songs that really stick out. In fact, just a testament to that, the very first song you'll hear in the game is the ringtone on my cell phone. The graphics in Bloodlines are also very good and have a much more violent and bloody feel than Castlevania 4, which is custom to Genesis games compared to Super Nintendo games. The characters all look nice and detailed and have a smooth animation. But perhaps the best thing about Bloodlines is the incredible setting mixed in with excellent environmental interactions. The game takes place all over Europe, which gives the developers really room to vary each level, and they do so splendidly. The most notable one for me is the Leaning Tower of Pisa level. Going around the floating platforms while scaling up to the top of the tower has an excellent feel, and it's just awesome. Overall, the game takes place in 6 areas: Romania, Athens, Pisa, Germany, France, and then it ends in England at the castle Prosperina. I love the idea of going all over Europe, and it turns out to be one of my favorite aspects of the game. Another good thing is the secondary weapons. They're all familiar, but you have the ability to use them 2 ways. First, the standard way by pressing C, and second, they can perform a special attack by pressing up and C at the same time. These become especially useful during boss fights. Speaking of boss fights, they are all very good, and they all feel very different. But it stays true to the standard formula of just detecting their pattern and attacking when vulnerable. But I guess there's nothing you can really do about that. The final boss is Dracula, and he takes 3 forms. First, it's the standard Dracula look, then he transforms into a death-type character, and then finally into a giant beast demon. It feels more satisfying killing him this way than it does in Castlevania 4, where he only has 1 form. So that is a lot of good things, But what isn't so good? Well, primarily, it's the control. Gone is the ability to whip in 8 directions, and no longer can you adjust your jump in midair. Basically, Bloodlines controls like the original NES games, which is a big step down from Castlevania IV's controls. It's hard for me to believe that they got rid of the control scheme that works so well. It makes the game's challenge feel a little more cheap rather than based on skill. It also makes hitting enemies that aren't on your same level very difficult. Now, you can whip in different directions, but if you're playing as John, you have the ability to only whip up and diagonally or straight down. You cannot whip straight up or diagonally and down. It feels unfair at times, and I've always felt like the game would be much better with a better control scheme. Eric fares slightly better because he doesn't have to jump in order to attack at another angle, but like I said, I prefer to play as John because he has the whip. My last complaint is the length of the game. You can beat this game in only a couple of hours without much trouble because it only has 6 levels, whereas Castlevania 4 has 11. It goes by rather quick. The fact that you have 2 characters to play as and a couple of difficulty levels add to the replayability, but it just feels short and it's over way too quick. The game is challenging, which adds to the length sort of, but it feels like a cheap tactic, just to trick you into thinking the game is longer than it really is.
So who wins? Well, I think the answer for me is clear. Super Castlevania 4 has the edge, definitely. The controls are good, the graphics are nice, the music's great, and overall, it's an excellent game. Bloodlines is very good, and while it takes steps ahead of Castlevania 4 in terms of graphics and level interaction, it goes backwards in terms of control and length. And control is really the biggest drawback of Bloodlines. It keeps it from really being an excellent game. I do prefer the setting and the gore of Bloodlines, but unfortunately that's not really enough to make it the better game. Now, I easily recommend both of these games to anybody, but if I have to choose, which I do, Super Castlevania 4 is my game of choice. Thanks for watching, guys. This is part 2 of my Halloween special, Sega vs. Nintendo, Castlevania, and we will see you next time. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking to yourself that developed games for the NES. So, the likelihood of a Castlevania game coming out on a Sega console were pretty slim. It is worth mentioning, though, that the Castlevania, the original, was ported to a couple of home computers like the Commodore 64, the Commodore Amiga, and the IBM home computer. Why the hell is he wearing a suit jacket? Well, my answer to that would be, why not? No, truthfully, I have to go to a wedding this weekend, and this was just hanging in the closet. Anyway, we're not here to talk about suit jackets, we're here to talk about Castlevania. Oh yeah, Castlevania. Castlevania is one of my favorite NES games to play, and you know, it shows its age, but I still really enjoy going back and playing it. The controversial sequel, Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, really I haven't played enough of to comment on. Castlevania 3, however, excellent game, one of my favorites on the NES, period. But while the NES was getting all these great Castlevania games, the Sega Master System was sort of left in the dark, and that's probably the biggest problem with the Sega Master System. It just didn't have third-party support. You can probably blame Nintendo for that, as they pretty much held a stranglehold on developers